My name is Greg Wiens, and I'm with Healthy Growing Churches, and we're committed to engaging churches and leaders to multiply. And I want to talk to you as a church planter this morning on 3 different levels. And the first one is basically on how to launch healthy. And having planted a couple of churches myself personally, having daughtered churches, and having coached hundreds of churches, there's some things that I've begun to see that often stumble early on in the stages of planting. And the first one is that we often don't launch healthy. And just like a baby who's born preemie, so are when churches don't launch healthy, they suffer consequences for a long time. And it's amazing to me as you study the New Testament that Paul never set out to plant a church. I mean, it's amazing. He set out to make disciples in cities, and the church was, in fact, the venue in which those disciples were growing up in Christ, and it was an opportunity for those believers to come together. And so I think as we talk about planting churches, the thing we got to keep in mind, first of all, is our mission is to make disciples, and that's not a debatable issue. But it becomes very easy, I know personally, and all planters experience this, to feel the need to get a large group of people together. In fact, we often use the 98.6 rule, that if they have a temperature of 98.6, man, they're good, we can put them in leadership. I've done that many times, and we suffer long-term consequences. So I want to give you a concept called scaffolding. I want to help you realize that many of the people who are initially attracted, not only in churches I've planted, but many of the churches I've worked with, the people who initially are attracted to a church plant from scratch, especially if you're not starting with the launch team. And by the way, that's an important thing, is you call people who work with you initially launch team, not core. Because if you call them core, eventually when they leave, they feel like you're losing the core of the church, and that's not true. Because you see, initially when the people who come to you are often what we call scaffolding. They're people who just like when you build a building, you build up the scaffolding so that you can build the building. And in the same way with planting a church or starting a church, it's often the people who are there in the initial stages are scaffolding. God uses them in cool ways to help him build the church through you. But just like when the building is built, the scaffolding is torn down. In some of the same ways, once the church is established, a lot of these people who initially join you will leave. And the same thing, I mean, the hard thing is when these people who first come to you to help you start this church, they become your friends. And it becomes so very, very difficult when they begin to leave. In fact, a great book you might enjoy is called A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman, where he talks about what happens when people leave you when you start something like a church. And it's just, it can rip your heart out. And so I see that. I just want you to understand that often you may be very surprised that the very people who you think are going to be with you long term are the ones who leave. We call them scaffolding. That's a symptom and a phenomenon that is in most churches. Understand that's very typical. Plan on it. One of the other things I want to talk about is that I really am convinced that you need 5 kind of important relationships as a planter. You need a supervisor. In other words, you need a board or someone who's going to basically provide accountability and provide some of that leadership of you as a planter. You need a coach, someone who's going to help you with leadership skills, someone who's going to be able to speak into your life as far as planting a church, as far as leading in that context of a new plant, someone who's been there before, knows some of the pitfalls and can help you with that. You need a mentor. The third thing is you need someone who helps you with life skills. Usually this mentor is a longer term relationship than a coach. They're one who's known you a longer period of time. They know your wife or your husband. They know your kids, and they can know when you're pulling the wool over their eyes, and they're going to help you deal with things like where's your quiet time, where's your walk with the Lord, how's your relationship with your spouse, your kids during the planting. They're going to help you deal with some of those life issues. Fourth kind of relationship you need is a trainer. Oftentimes you'll need someone who may come in at certain stages of the church plant and help you plant. Specifically like funding or governance or some special issue. Well, we bring in a trainer. Maybe the trainer is a 6-month kind of relationship usually, or maybe less. But they'll come in and help you just for a few months deal with a specific skill that the coach says we need to get someone in to help you with this specific skill. So that's a trainer. And the last one is a therapist. The enemy will do whatever he can do to thwart churches. I mean, if he's going to kill a church, the easiest time to kill it is when it's young. And so I personally have seen that those 5 kind of relationships are so critical that we need to have at least a therapist that you feel you can call on, a trainer who can help you deal with individual skills as the coach sees you needed them, a mentor who's going to hold you kind of accountable for some life skills, relational skills with your family and your own personal life, coach who's going to help you hold you accountable for these leadership skills, and lastly, a supervisor. And what we often find that a lot of churches that are involved in networks and everything else, they confound those relationships. They try to find somebody who can do 2 or 3 of those relationships, and they're really confounding that way. And I would suggest that if you don't have different people in each of those 5 relationships, you'll probably not be as effective in each of those relationships. Last thing I would suggest is a lot of guys and men and women who plant, they come in with this compelling vision. I have this vision, this is what God's given me in my heart. And so often that undermines launching healthy, because as I work with churches, the more I'm convinced that, a vision is an overlap of 3 circles. The one is the gifts and calling and the passion of the leader, you as a planter. The second circle is the overlap of the congregation, the body that forms around that leader. And sometimes they're very similar, but sometimes God brings some people in the body and the body forms in a way that they're not completely aligned. But there's a third circle, and the third circle is what I call community needs. And the real vision of a church is not just what's in the heart of the leadership of the pastor or what's in the body, but it's also what are the needs of the community. And it's the overlap of all 3 of those circles. And so I'm a little concerned launching healthy when pastors, they come in, this is my planter, man, this is my vision, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And they're not willing to literally be able to say, okay, but who is God bringing around us, and how do I need to tailor, to script my vision in light of the people God's bringing around us, and what are the needs of the community? So the vision is a kind of a combination of all those 3. And therefore, a healthy vision and launching healthy really evolves. Building the Bridge as You Walk on It by Robert Quinn's a great book on that concept. But basically, it's an overlap of those 3. So that's to launch healthy. You need to realize that you will have scaffolding. You will have people who will join you but then leave. You'll also realize that they're a launch team, not a core team. 5 key relationships you need to keep in mind, but also you need to keep in mind that you're in it for the long haul, and your vision isn't necessarily what you bring in before you launch, but what evolves in the first few years of that church. So that's how you launch healthy. Second thing I'd like to talk about, second segment, so to speak, that I'd like to talk about with planters is how do you lead the team? How do you personally get involved and how do you relate to and lead the leaders that God raises, or that uses you to raise in that body? Well, one of the unique things for me, and I just have a passion for, is helping leaders discover their A game. And you need to realize that, we all have mentors. We all have people that we admire in our network or outside of our network that we want to plant like they do. But God may not have wired you like that. God has wired every planter in a very unique way. You have unique gifts, unique skills. And if you don't know your uniqueness, you'll never be able to lead your team nor the body like God's gifted you to lead. Plenty of biblical examples. We can look at David in the Old Testament, who refused to fight Goliath with Saul's armor. He fought him like he fought him, with his own sling and his own armor. Paul says, in 1 Corinthians, some say I like Paul, some say I like Cephas, some say I like Apollos. The reality is all 3 of those guys. Apollos was the teacher, Peter just loved to hang out with you, and Paul was the get-her-done kind of guy. They all 3 were different kinds of leaders. People were attracted to different kind of leaders. And God used all 3, but none of them tried to be the other. So I would suggest, to lead well, you need to know your team. You need to know your gifts really, really well. Whether they're outside assessments, there's a lot of different ways you can do that. But in that assessment, I would suggest that you look at something we call emotional intelligence, because one of the areas that I find most planters are lower on is EQ. EQ is basically 4 concepts. It's how well do you know your own emotions, how well do you know other people's emotions, how well do you express your emotions, and how well do you allow other people to express your emotions. Well, let me encourage you to say that more people will follow you because of your EQ than your IQ. In fact, more people will follow you because of your EQ than your vision. And that's kind of hard to think. I got this compelling vision. People are going to buy into the vision. We're going to move. That's true. But people buy into you personally first. And you have to have a healthy emotional intelligence. You have to develop your EQ. And so there's a lot of great resources out there. EQ for Dummies by a guy named Stein is a great resource. But let me suggest that as you begin to understand your unique strengths as far as the personality is concerned, your unique spiritual gifts, your unique passions and motivators, your unique values, as you begin to understand those kinds of things about you, it will script the way you lead. And then I would suggest it's going to script the team you need to bring around you. See, I'm convinced anybody can plant a church. I know that's contrary to a lot of assessments, but I've done thousands of assessments over the last 10 years, 15 years. And literally, I'm convinced anybody can plant. It's just a matter of what team do they bring around them. So, you need to, and I'm not carte blanche saying everybody should plant. No, I'm not saying that. But what I'm saying is you need to understand what you are uniquely given by God, and then what's the team you need to bring around you, a team of people who complement you in the very areas I mentioned a moment ago: personality, passions, spiritual gifts. They all should not be like you. They should all share similar mission, vision, and values, but they don't necessarily have the same personality, same strengths, and so forth. So that's, to lead a team well, you got to know your strengths, you got to know yourself really well, and you got to know the team really well. The last segment I want to talk a little bit about is what I call leveraging the stage you're in. As far as church planters, most of us, we think about launching and getting the church healthy. We don't think of what's going to happen, 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road. I mean, we have this vision of what it may look like, but we don't think of the stages we have to go through to get there. And let me just suggest to you that as I've worked with church planters and existing churches, that every church goes through what we call life cycles. And for a church to be long-term, healthy, and impactful in its community, it needs to appreciate the life cycle that a church goes through. The church is a living body. The most common metaphor Paul uses for the church of Jesus Christ in the New Testament is the body of Christ. It's a living organism. It's dynamic. And just as my body has I've got a life cycle, so do churches. But as I study churches, it's a 20 to 30 year life cycle that churches go through, and I can show you through that. It's really simple to understand that when you're starting the church where you are as a planter, it's a run and gun. It's an apostolic, heavily gifted in the apostolic end. So the giftings you'll find in people are apostolic kind of gifts. You look for high D's and high I's kind of thing in the disc realm. But that's what launches the church, and we see that in the Bible, Acts 1:8. But Jesus says, "But you'll be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and Samaria, and the ends of the earth." He gives them a clear vision, because that initial stage of that church is vision driven. But if you don't in that church very quickly build healthy relationships with people inside the body and people outside the body, you're just dreaming, man. You don't have a church. And so what we see in Acts 2 is, in Acts 2:42 through 47, we see that, and they dedicated themselves to apostles' teachings and the breaking of bread, and at least 8 or 9 times in 2:42 through 47 do we hear they did things together. They built healthy relationships, and we're told that they had respect from people outside the church. So they had healthy relationships inside and healthy relationships outside, shaped around that vision. See, the relationships were there to fulfill that vision Jesus gave them in Acts 1:8. And that church continues to grow. And what we see as those apostolic gifts are often we find prophetic gifts and teaching gifts begin to come into the body, and some of the S's and the C's begin to enter the body in the disc kind of framework, and we see that body continue to grow and get healthy. And eventually, for the church really to be healthy, you not only have to have vision and relationships, you need to have ministries, and we see that in Acts 4. If you continue following that first life cycle, they sold their possessions, they gave to the poor. We know from Acts 6 they were taking care of the widows and orphans. So all kinds of ministries developed, but you see the ministries that were developing were simply enabling them, their organized ways of developing healthy relationships inside the body and outside the body, which were to fulfill that vision. So that church went through those life cycles in the book of Acts, and we see that in every church, that if you don't build healthy relationships that come out in some expression of ministries, the church doesn't gain any synergy or momentum. And then the final stage, as a church grows through life cycles, is what we call the structure stage. It's vision, relationships, ministries, and then structure. And in Acts, we see that in Acts 6, where the Hellenistic widows were complaining against the Hebraic widows because they weren't getting served. And see, the ministries were breaking down. Why were the ministries breaking down? Because there was no structure. So they set apart a board, and they became known as a deacon board. But I find it interesting that, when the widows were complaining or their families were complaining, the apostles didn't say, it says in Philippians to shut up and sit down and do everything without complaining. Philippians hadn't been written yet, so they couldn't say that. But the reality was, no, they said, no, there's a real good reason why they're complaining. Our structure is breaking down. So they developed a structure. So I find it interesting that as they develop structure, it's often the C's and the S's that develop healthy structures in this life cycle. So it's really cool as you as a church realize that you as most planters are, visionary kind of people to start life cycles. But you need the rest with the gifts and the personalities and everything else to really fulfill and mature that life cycle, out of which, as we see in Acts 8, another life cycle is birthed when we're told that a great persecution broke out against the church, and the disciples were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. So all of a sudden the church now, for 10 to 15 years, has been in Jerusalem. All of a sudden now, it's launching a new life cycle into Judea and Samaria. So healthy churches understand the life cycle and how they lead in the midst of the life cycle. So I like to just encourage you as a planter, something I gave my life to, continue to give my life to. I am so encouraged by what God's calling you to do. I just want to see you be healthy for the long term. And for you being healthy for the long term, it means you launch healthy. It means you lead healthy, a team and not a solo performance. And then you leverage the stage you're in a healthy way. So thank you very much. Again, my name is Greg Wiens from Healthy Growing Churches. It's a privilege for me to share these things with you.